McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President. Freedom is a principle, a basic principle of the political party I support, the Liberal National Party of Queensland. It is also an underlying principle of the Liberal Party of Australia and the National Party. And we believe in freedom, in individual freedom, in self-responsibility, in the family, in support for disadvantaged. But freedom is one of our underlying basic tenets. And Mr. Acting Deputy President, freedom, I also thought, was a basic core value of universities around the world. And I thought universities welcomed differences of opinion, welcomed debate, welcomed views that may not be popular, which may not be the majority views, but welcomed different views. And so I've been distressed over the last year about a university which I always praise, which I call my university, although I never was able to afford to go there or clever enough to get a scholarship there back in the early days, and that's the James Cook University of North Queensland, which has done a wonderful job in many fields, has a wonderful campus in Townsville and Cairns and Singapore, and generally as a university I support very strongly and enthusiastically. But I have to say that I have been concerned at the way James Cook University has treated a couple of academics who didn't agree with the normal view accepted by perhaps the majority of scientists on climate change and on the Great Barrier Reef. Now, I'm clearly not a scientist and I can't go into the scientific differences, but I did appreciate that there were different views from two very distinguished scientists, the late Professor Bob Carter and Professor Peter Ridd. Professor Carter was an adjunct professor at the university and had a different view on climate change, and he, to my way of seeing the issue, was forced out of James Cook University because he had a view that didn't fit the norm of most scientists. Now, I'd spoken to Professor Carter before his death. His basic principle, his basic argument was about accepting that climate change is happening and we should be focusing our attention not on more research on why it happened, but on rehabilitation in dealing with the impacts of climate change. He's a very sensible man, a very learned scientist in my view, but he was forced out effectively of James Cook University. And then there's Professor Peter Ridd, who has a different view on the Great Barrier Reef. A view, I might say, that as a non-scientist I share because I've lived on the Great Barrier Reef, adjacent to it, all of my life. And I have to say most of the constituents I represent along the Barrier Reef also agree with Professor Peter Ridd, not from a scientific viewpoint, but from their own observations over a lifetime. And yet Professor Ridd was eventually sacked by James Cook University, and I, some time ago, wrote to the learned Vice-Chancellor, a good friend of mine, Professor Sandra Harding, on the 30th of August last year, expressing my concerns about what I understood to be the situation relating to Professor Ridd. And as I indicated in that letter to Professor Harding, I didn't have all the facts, but it seemed to me that this was a case of disciplining a scientist who didn't agree with other scientists at JCU and at the Australian Institute of Marine Science. Now, I do say that Professor Harding wrote back to me and explained that that wasn't the reason that Professor Ridd was being disciplined, and it was about personal behaviour and not questioning the veracity of another researcher's science. Now, he did, according to news reports, make some comments about work done by Professor Terry Hughes from James Cook University, who is always out there following or leading perhaps the Greens political party lines on all the horrors that are happening on the Barrier Reef, when other researchers like Professor Ridd and people who are on the reef all the time, like the constituents I serve, would have thought that Professor Hughes's comments were slightly over the top, to put it politely. But nevertheless, Peter Ridd has now separated from the university, and I think it's a great shame that, whether or not it's true, but the perception is that James Cook University, which I love and support all the time, has disciplined two distinguished scientists because they didn't agree with the mob thought on climate change and the Great Barrier Reef. As Peter McCutcheon said in a transcript, an interview on the ABC, he said this: the former professor's crime was to speak disparagingly of his colleagues who found that the Great Barrier Reef was in peril because of farming runoff and climate change. Now, Mr Acting Deputy President, I have to say it's strange to be a bedfellow of the National Tertiary Education Union, but I agree with Mr Andrew Bennell from that union, who said, and I quote, "The fundamental issue is that academic freedom is indivisible, and you can't have academic freedom for people you agree with and not for people you disagree with." Mr Acting Deputy President, Peter Ridd was asked whether his view was a minority view, and he correctly said, yes, absolutely it is, but science isn't a democracy. It's not the most votes, it is who's got the evidence. And Peter Ridd's complaint about some scientific work on the Great Barrier Reef is that it's not peer-reviewed and not properly peer-reviewed. And he is concerned, as he said in a note to me, that his focus was on calling for better assurance, quality assurance, for any science upon which the government base big spending decisions. Presently, so much of this science is never properly checked, despite what science organisations may claim to the contrary. The fact that they do not accept that we have a quality problem is worse than the bad science they often produce. Now, for those comments, Professor Ridd is no longer there. I must say I don't agree with everything Professor Ridd said. In fact, he criticises in some media outlets the Australian Institute of Marine Science, which I think is a quality organisation of very, very good scientists. And my understanding, limited as it is that in many issues they don't altogether disagree with Professor Ridd. So I'm very disappointed that the university I love and support has been tagged as being anti-freedom to express these views. Mr Acting Deputy President, in the short time available to me, I also want to mention the Australian National University and the way they've handled the bequest of money to set up a degree course in Western civilisation, and the ridiculous comments you've got in relation to the rejection by ANU of that bequest is quite frightening. It was apparently rejected by ANU, and of course the professor there, the Chancellor there, is Gary Evans, the former Federal Labor Minister, who, when he was here, called himself Gareth Evans, who, along with the National University Student Association, the National Tertiary Education Union, said the program would push a racist or a radically conservative agenda. Well, even if it did, in a university you'd think that they'd be able to handle that and have arguments against it. But of course, as the organisation looking after that bequest indicated, this wasn't about any sort of racist issue on Western civilisation, but about our modern society and how we should look to the foundations of our society. And I conclude by quoting the Education Minister, Simon Birmingham, who said, "It's essential that universities are not only open to but enthusiastic about the study of values that help create both them and modern society in which we now enjoy unparalleled opportunities. I hope that other universities," and this is Senator Birmingham said, "in discussions with the Ramsay Centre resist ill-informed or politically correct objections and find a way to ensure that this generous bequest enables a valuable study of foundations of our society.
Thank you, Senator.